On November 18th in the year 1883, the railroads create the first time zone. At exactly noon on this day, American and Canadian railroads began using 4 continental time zones to end the confusion of dealing with thousands of local times. The bold move was emblematic of the power shared by the railroad companies. The need for continental time zones stemmed directly from the problems of moving passengers and freight over thousands of miles of rail line that covered North America by the 1880s. Since human beings had first begun keeping track of time, they set their clocks to the local movement of the sun. Even as late as the 1880s, most towns in the U.S. had their own local time, generally based on high noon. I love that. Or the time when the sun was at its highest point in the sky. As railroads began to shrink the travel time between cities from days or months to mere hours, however, these local times became a scheduling nightmare. Railroad timetables in major cities listed dozens of different arrival and departure times for the same damn train, each linked to a different local time zone. Efficient rail transportation demanded a more uniform timekeeping system. Rather than turning to the federal governments of the United States and Canada to create a North American system of time zones, the powerful railroad companies took it upon themselves to create a new time code system. The companies agreed to divide the continent into 4 time zones. The dividing lines adopted were very close to the ones we still use today. Most Americans and Canadians quickly embraced their new time zones, since railroads were often their lifeblood and main link with the rest of the world. However, it was not until 1918 that Congress officially adopted the railroad time zones and put them under the supervision of the Interstate Commerce Commission. On November 18th in 1978, People's Temper founder Jim Jones led hundreds of his followers in a mass murder-suicide at their agricultural commune in a remote part of the South American nation of Guyana. Many of Jones' followers willingly ingested a poison-laced punch, while others were forced to do so at gunpoint. The final continuance of eternity at Jonestown that day was 909. A third of the people who continued their eternity on this day were children. Jim Jones was a charismatic churchman who established the People's Temple, a Christian sect in Indianapolis in the 1950s. He preached against racism, and his integrated congregation attracted many African Americans. In 1965, he moved the group to Northern California, settling in Ukiah, and after 1971 in San Francisco. In the 1970s, his church was accused by the media of financial fraud, physical abuse of its members, and mistreatment of children. In response to the mounting criticism, the increasingly paranoid Jones invited his congregation to move with him to Guyana, where he promised they would build a socialist utopia. 3 years earlier, a small group of his followers had traveled to the tiny nation to set up what would become Jonestown on a tract of jungle. Jonestown did not turn out to be the paradise their leader had promised. Temple members worked long days in the fields and were subjected to harsh punishments if they questioned Jones' authority. Their passports were confiscated, their letters home censored, and members were encouraged to inform on one another and forced to attend lengthy late-night meetings. Jones, by then in declining mental health and addicted to drugs, was convinced the U.S. government and others were out to destroy him. He required Temple members to participate in mock suicide drills in the middle of the night. In 1978, a group of former Temple members and concerned relatives of current members convinced U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan, a Democrat of California, to travel to Jonestown and investigate the settlement. On November 17th in 1978, Ryan arrived in Jonestown with a group of journalists and other observers. At first, the visit went well, but the next day, as Ryan's delegation was about to leave, several Jonestown residents approached the group and asked them for passage out of Guyana. Jones became distressed at the defection of his followers, and one of Jones's lieutenants attacked Ryan with a knife. The congressman escaped from the incident unharmed, but Jones then ordered Ryan and his companions ambushed and killed at the airstrip as they attempted to leave. Jones's henchmen did find the congressman and 4 others as they boarded their plane. On this day, Congressman Leo Ryan and the 4 others that were with him continued their eternities. Back in Jonestown, Jones commanded everyone to the main pavilion to commit what he termed a revolutionary act. Today, we remember the people of Jonestown who continue their eternity. It was November 18th in the year 1996 that Tony Silva, a world-renowned expert and outspoken protector of exotic birds, is sentenced to 7 years in prison without parole for leading an illegal parrot smuggling operation. Silva was only one of many to be arrested during Operation Renegade, a 3-year international probe into bird smuggling by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Division of Law Enforcement, although his case was by far the best known. Silva's indictment and guilty plea shocked the international community of academic experts, conservationists, zoologists, and collectors interested in exotic birds, most of whom had known and respected him as a benevolent bird lover. Since his childhood, Silva had championed the cause of protecting wildlife. His parents, who had immigrated to the U.S. from Cuba when he was a boy, encouraged his love of birds, thinking it was a good way to keep their son out of trouble. Silva began breeding birds at a young age, and by his 20s, he had already written hundreds of articles and 2 books on rare parrots, and had been named curator at Laurel Park, a wildlife sanctuary in the Canary Islands. However, Silva's image greatly changed when he was accused of smuggling more than 100 hyacinth macaws valued at almost $1.4 million, as well as hundreds of other exotic birds. Now, hyacinth macaws are extremely rare, having a wild population numbering between only 2,000 and 5,000. During smuggling operations, many of the birds continue their eternity. U.S. District Judge Eleno Bucklow, outraged at the inhumane treatment the birds had received at the hands of the smugglers, handed down a uniquely harsh sentence in the Silva case: an 82-month prison term, a $100,000 fine, and an order to perform 200 hours of community service during a 3-year supervised release program after his prison term. The real victims of these crimes, the judge said, were the birds themselves, and our children and future generations who may never have the opportunity to see any of these rare birds. Silva later claimed that he was set up and had only been trying to protect the birds. However, many disagree with Silva's interpretation of the events, citing the evidence from his trial, which included photographs of dead parrots, a book detailing his smuggling operations found at his home, and a taped conversation of Silva saying that he had 50 hyacinth macaws for sale. Information documented and divulged on this audio file can be verified.